Every human civilization ever studied, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years with zero contact between them, arrived independently at the exact same conclusion about one specific yellow metal. It was worth more than almost anything else a person could own. Not food, not tools, not land. A soft, heavy, faintly glowing rock that couldn't be eaten, couldn't be used to cut anything, and couldn't keep anyone warm. And yet, from the Balkans to Egypt to the Andes, cultures that never once exchanged a single word with each other reached the identical verdict. This metal matters more than almost anything. That's a strange enough coincidence to actually deserve an explanation, so let's find one. Start with the chemistry, because gold's appeal isn't really cultural at its root. It's physical, and it's genuinely unusual among naturally occurring metals. Gold almost never reacts with oxygen, which means it doesn't rust, doesn't tarnish, and doesn't corrode, even after sitting buried in wet soil for thousands of years. Every gold object ever recovered from an ancient grave still looks essentially the way it did the day it was made. That single property alone separates gold from nearly everything else available to a prehistoric toolmaker, because iron rusts, bronze develops a dull patina, and silver tarnishes black within months of exposure to air. Gold simply doesn't degrade. It is also remarkably soft and malleable, meaning it can be hammered, stretched, and shaped using nothing more than a stone tool and patience, without cracking or shattering the way most other materials do under repeated impact. And critically, gold frequently occurs in nature as visible metallic nuggets and flakes sitting directly in stream beds and riverbanks, requiring no smelting, no furnace, and no advanced metallurgical knowledge to collect and use. You could find it, pick it up, and immediately start shaping it. Almost no other useful material on Earth offers that same combination: permanent, workable, and findable without technology. Which brings us to the oldest confirmed gold objects ever recovered, and the discovery story behind them is genuinely worth knowing in detail. In October of 1972, an excavator operator named Raicho Marinov was digging near the Bulgarian city of Varna on the Black Sea coast when his machine turned up a handful of small metal objects. He had no idea what he'd found. He gathered them into a shoebox and took them home, and it was only a few days later that local archaeologists identified what Marinov had accidentally uncovered: a vast Copper Age burial ground now known as the Varna Necropolis. Extensive excavation over the following 2 decades revealed 294 individual graves, and radiocarbon dating placed the site at roughly 4,600 to 4,200 BC, meaning these burials predate the great civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia by well over 1,000 years. Scattered across those graves, archaeologists recovered more than 3,000 individual gold artifacts, together weighing approximately 6 kilograms, the oldest processed gold ever found anywhere on the planet. What makes Varna genuinely remarkable, though, isn't simply the age of the gold. It's what the distribution of that gold reveals about the society that made it. The graves at Varna were not equally furnished. The majority contained very little: a stone bead, a flint blade, a simple bone bracelet. Roughly 1 in 5 held small gold items, beads or pendants. But a small handful of graves, just 4 out of the full 294, contained close to 3/4 of every gold object found at the entire site. One grave in particular, generally referred to as Grave 43, and believed to hold a man of high status, contained more gold on its own than has been recovered anywhere else in the world, dating to that same period. Strangest of all, several of the richest graves weren't burials at all. Archaeologists call them cenotaphs, symbolic graves containing elaborate gold offerings and, in a few cases, a mask made of unbaked clay, arranged where a head would normally rest, but with no actual human remains inside. Nobody is fully certain what these empty, gold-laden graves represented, whether they honored someone who died elsewhere and whose body was never recovered, or served some other ritual purpose entirely, and archaeologists remain genuinely divided on the question. What the pattern does make unmistakably clear is this: by roughly 4,600 BC, the community at Varna had already developed real, visible social hierarchy, a small number of individuals whose position, whether inherited, earned, or granted through religious authority, was significant enough to be marked permanently with a rare, unusually valuable material. This is widely regarded as some of the clearest direct archaeological evidence anywhere in the world for organized social inequality, encoded quite literally in gold, roughly 6,500 years ago. Long before pyramids, long before writing, long before anything resembling a formal state, humans had already worked out that a permanent, non-perishable material could be used to visibly and durably mark who mattered most. There's a deeper insight buried inside this too, one that archaeologist Sven Hansen, who has studied the Varna material closely, has pointed toward. Unlike food, which spoils, or wooden tools, which rot and break, gold and other early metals could be melted down and reshaped indefinitely without ever being consumed or lost. A broken gold object wasn't actually broken. It was simply gold, waiting to become something else. That property, permanence, combined with endless reusability, is genuinely unlike almost anything else available to a prehistoric economy, and it very plausibly explains why gold specifically, rather than some other attractive material, became such an effective way to store and visibly display wealth across such a long stretch of human history. The genuinely striking part of this story is how completely independent it all was. Varna sits in what's now Bulgaria, isolated from the river valleys where Egyptian civilization would eventually rise along the Nile, and further still from the mountains of the Andes, where cultures on an entirely separate continent would later develop their own elaborate gold-working traditions. There was no shared trade network connecting all of these places at this early stage, no traveling merchant carrying the idea from one culture to another. Each of these societies appears to have arrived at gold's significance on its own, through direct, hands-on encounter with the material's genuinely unusual physical properties. Somewhere, a person picked a shining nugget out of a riverbed, noticed it never seemed to dull or corrode no matter how long it sat around, discovered it could be hammered into new shapes without cracking, and understood, correctly, that they were holding something rare. That instinct, permanent, workable, visibly special, turned out to be remarkably consistent wherever humans encountered the metal, entirely independent of language, geography, or any shared cultural contact whatsoever, which suggests something worth sitting with. The value of gold was never really an arbitrary story humans agreed to believe, layered artificially on top of an ordinary rock. It was a direct, repeated, independently rediscovered response to something genuinely unusual about the material itself, a substance that simply refuses to decay, sitting quietly in a riverbed roughly 6,500 years ago, waiting for someone to notice.